Marcus Boon is the author of 2 books published by Harvard University Press, The Road of Excess, A History of Writers on Drugs in 2002, and In Praise of Copying from 2010. This is what he said about himself. I grew up in London to English and German parents and came of age during the punk era, turned on by hearing Anarchy in the UK on pirate radio one night in a bedroom in the suburbs, and by a recording of John Coltrane's My Favorite Things, also heard in the same bedroom. I studied English literature at University College London while writing reviews for the New Musical Express, DJing warehouse parties, and making trips to New York, where I encountered the splendorous world of New York City hip-hop, graffiti, African bambata, electro, and other dance scenes. While completing a PhD in comparative literature at NYU, he also encountered Michael Taussig, and it was through Mick that I first met Marcus. Tonight he's going to respond, I think, to Stephen Goodman's recent book, Sonic Warfare, and propose a different way of thinking about vibrational ontology and what it would mean to think of vibration as a political problem. Please welcome Marcus Boon.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Annette, and everyone at SVA for inviting me, and thank you for being here. I lost my voice earlier this week, and there's still a kind of huskiness that makes me sound like Teddy Pendergrass or something, which is kind of nice. Barry White, I don't know. But if you can't hear me, just holler and I'll try to speak louder. So, when I heard there was a super big screen here at SVA, I thought it would be a great opportunity to watch some YouTube videos. And you know, mostly when you watch YouTube videos, you watch them on your phone or your computer, and it's very rare that you actually get a chance to see them blown up this big. And I think that in itself will be a pleasurable experience. I also want to say the materials that I'm talking about date to 2011 for the most part, and also 2012, like earlier this year. So they're pretty new. And one of the kind of pleasures of giving a talk, but also one of the terrors of it, maybe, is that nothing has really been decided as to what these things mean. You know, like there's 3,000 comments on YouTube, which constitutes some kind of canon of commentary, I guess. But this is an opportunity to think together about what the meaning of these videos are. And so, you know, I invite you to think them through, and after I've given you my take on things, I'd be really interested to hear your take, okay? So my current work concerns the politics of vibration in thinking of sound as a kind of vibration, music as a particular kind of organization of sound, popular music as all of the above, and therefore part of a set of practices that work with vibration. The politics of vibration, for me, begins with a problem, the relative inaccessibility of vibration, that even as we speak of a vibrational ontology, in other words, of vibration as a or the fundamental constituent of reality, which is what contemporary physics, the most prestigious knowledge form that exists today, does, somehow vibration disappears in our very attempt to point to it. What does it mean to speak of vibration, to describe it? What is the relationship of language to vibration? And how does language compare to other media or practices, such as music making, that are capable of perhaps more direct access to vibration? That's what a song is, a vibrational structure with words attached to it, or vice versa. And that's kind of, in many ways, the core of my talk is to just get you to think about how weird it is that there are things called songs, that one puts words to music. It's the most obvious everyday thing. We all know what a song is, and yet the strangeness of associating vibrational form with words in that particular way, that's something I want you to gain an appreciation for if you don't already. What can be done with that? Does it point to a set of practices that go beyond discourse in politically resonant ways? Or is vibration, because of its inaccessibility, always something either inchoate or discursively ordered, at best a pleasurable dead end? I continue to be provoked by Jacques Attali's assertion, recently repeated by Steve Goodman, of an essential relationship between music and violence. Music, as the organization of sound, performed as a sacrifice, in other words, ritualized violence, to ward off the threat of an otherwise uncontrollable violence that an unorganized sound would apparently constitute. I'm interested in rethinking this formula through Julia Kristeva's work on abjection and the kora, and thinking about music in relation to a twofold taboo. And this is what Kristeva does. She says, everyone's obsessed with the taboo on violence, but there's also a taboo on eroticism. And how do we think about music as an attempt to organize, negotiate, respond to these two taboos, that of violence, which Girard talks about, that of eroticism, which Kristeva focuses on. In writing about the politics of vibration, there are no lack of case studies to be made. Wilhelm Reich's work on the political function of the orgasm and his attempt to build a liberatory politics out of creating the conditions for the free flow of vibratory energy, aka the orgone, comes to my mind. In music too, a discourse of vibration runs through 20th century music, and particularly the music of the 1960s and 70s, from Lamont Young to psychedelic rock to reggae to free jazz, each with its own explicit politics of vibration. It may seem counterintuitive to focus here on the work of popular contemporary LA hip-hop crew Odd Future and New York rapper Azealia Banks, but I hope to show that their immersion in transgression of various kinds opens up a new kind of politics of vibration. I'd like to focus first on Tyler, the Creator's video for his song Yonkers, which came out last year. How many people have already seen this video? Okay, good. That's better than my fourth year seminar at York, which I would say only 10% of the students had watched it. And while I'm at it, how many people have seen the Azealia Banks video? Okay, good, most of you. How many people have heard the new Frank Ocean record? Okay, great. Just to give a little context, Tyler is a key figure in Odd Future. He makes the music for many Odd Future tracks, as well as directing some of the videos. Kanye West pronounced the video for Yonkers the best video of last year. It's received over 50 million YouTube views. I think that in itself qualifies it as being right in the center of what is called popular culture today. And I want to reflect on just how weird that is and how interesting. So I'm going to show the video, okay?
deaf rock stars wearing synthetic wigs made of anwars, dreadlocks, bedrock, harder than a motherfucking Flintstone, making crack rocks out of pussy nigga fish bones. This nigga Jasper tryna get grown, about 5'7" of his bitches in my bedroom. Swallow the cinnamon, I'ma scribble this shit and shit while Sid is telling me that she's been getting intimate with men. Sid, shut the fuck up. Here's the number to my therapist. You tell him all your problems, he's fucking awesome with listening. I told him to quit bitching, this isn't a fucking hotline for a fucking shrink. Sheesh, I already got mine and he's not fucking working. I think I'm wasting my damn time. I'm clocking 6:03 and going postal. This the revenge of the dicks, that's 9 cocks that cock 9. This ain't no V-Tech shit or Columbine, but after bowling I went home for some damn adventure time. What you do? I slipped myself some pink Xannies and danced around the house and all over print panties. Mom's gone, that fucking broad will never understand me. I'm not gay, I just wanna boogie to some Marvin. What you think I hated you? Fuck her, Wolf Haley robbing them. I'll crash that fucking airplane at that faggot nigga Bob is in and stab Bruno Mars in his goddamn esophagus and won't stop until the cops come in. I'm an overachiever, so how about I start a team of leaders and pick up Stevie Wonder to be the wide receiver. Green paper, gold teeth, and pregnant gold retrievers, all I want. Fuck money, diamonds, and bitches don't need them. But where the fat ones at? I got something to feed them. It's some cooking books, the black kids never wanted to read them. Snapback green, chia fucking leaves. It's been a couple months and Tina still ain't perma fucking weave. Damn.
So, I mean, there's a lot of different things one could say about the video. I'm going to focus on 2 areas here in this talk. 1, the figure of abjection. 2, that of aloneness, solitariness, or even isolation in relation to sound. 1, abjection. Tyler is joined by a Kafkaesque cockroach on his stool. He allows it to walk in his hands and then pops it into his mouth, but he can't keep it down, and as the camera flips back to silhouette, we see Tyler throw up. The cockroach is literally abjected. Something disgusting is swallowed, only to be spit up again, perhaps in the same way that a rapper spits rhymes. It is abjected. The lyric that accompanies the video is, however, about therapy. First recommended to Sid the Kid, Odd Future's DJ, for her love life complexities, then to Jesus for unspecified reasons, and finally for Tyler, for whom it's not working out either. While his mom is gone, Tyler, takes some Xanax and listens to Marvin Gaye, but that only leads to the emergence of his evil white alter ego, Wolf Haley, who wants to stab Bruno Mars. The motif of abjection is actually quite a common one in recent music videos. It's there in other Odd Future videos like the classic Earl by Earl Sweatshirt, in which someone brings a blender into a hair salon where Earl is hanging out, and various dubious substances are blended and consumed by the Odd Future crew, resulting in a drug experience in which fingernails are pulled out, Tyler has what looks like an epileptic fit in the backyard, and a white kid gets a nosebleed. Los Angeles alt disco queen Night Jewel's recent song, 1 Second of Love, stages a very low-key girls-only drug party in which a Dionysian goat-like creature and a black drag queen perform. At a key moment in the song, a series of objects cascade out of the assembled ladies' mouths. Loose pearls are caught in the palms of a hand. A jet of black slime lands on what looks like a tray of profiterole. A foot-long octopus tentacle lands on a pile of dollar bills. Has anyone seen the Night Jewel video? No. Oh, you should watch it. South African rapper Spoke Matambo's remarkable video for his cover version of Joy Division's She's Lost Control features a gang of young township kids in a dystopian industrial space somewhere in Cape Town who spew milk out of their mouths as they dance ecstatically to Spoke's dictatorial megaphone lyrics. Abjection was one of the key tropes of punk, and it remains a key trope of musical subcultures today. But why? I don't buy the crude sociological analysis that would simply say that it represents a rejection of the adult or mainstream world. I would like to argue that encoded in the act of abjection is an attempt at healing, and that Tyler specifically spells this out by juxtaposing images of grossness and violence with images of therapy, medication, and transcendence. Nor is Tyler the first to come up with this strategy. The kind of thinking I'm healing about, the kind of healing I am thinking about is described by Michael Taussig in his book Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man, a study of terror and healing. The book, amongst other things, describes Taussig's travels with shamanic healers in the Putumayo region of Colombia and their use of the psychotropic plant medicine known as yahe or ayahuasca. The healing work that Taussig describes is achieved in large part through the manipulation of sound. In fact, although vibration is only rarely addressed directly by Taussig, though he recently published a brilliant essay on humming, it does contain an implicit vibrational ontology. A quote from What Color is the Sacred? Song is the great medium. As breath and rhythm, it collates and connects the vibratory quality of being. What is the core of Taussig's work on healing? It is that through the combination of song, story, and medicinal plant, the shaman is able to open up, break down, fragment the enormous web of the social, political, physiological, and historical, and psychological too, in such a way that a new configuration of these forces becomes possible. This new configuration is what constitutes healing. The context in which the shaman works is that of colonial violence. But violence is not merely context. It is extremely close to being the form that healing takes too, since both healing and violence involve acts of transformation. Sometimes, for example, someone in the middle of a yahe session actually has to be tied down to a post to prevent themselves from doing damage either to themselves or others. Taussig calls the situation of openness to the power of vibration the space of death, a space of terror and or healing. As is well known, the shaman sings, but like the yahe taker, he also throws up. Another quote here. The curing fan whooshed down, rustling and crackling the space into a whirling storm of leaves as the chanting churned our tender stomachs and bowels once again. This is Taussig actually in a yahe session with a yahe healer. The song's pace changed all the time, and in it was the fury and the voyage in the song right there. And then Santiago, the shaman, would stop abruptly in mid-flight to tell a joke, to tell Luis Antonio to stop the dogs barking to bring chanda to chew while curing, or whatever, and then the tiniest hum might begin, a needle in the storm of stories and sounds of vomiting and people leaving to shit, and the song darted forth. Let us say that the context of musical subculture, whether Odd Future or Spoke Matambo or even Night Jewel, is also that of colonial, not to mention other forms of historical violence, and that contemporary musical subcultures are also working through those legacies, sonically and otherwise. But why should deep exposure to vibration be either healing or terrifying? There is a long history of thinking of music as therapy and as weapon. Most recently, we find it in Steve Goodman's book, Sonic Warfare, which reads Afro-diasporic sound cultures as appropriating the colonial militarization of sonic practices of governance and transforming them into practices of collective joy. In my opinion, Goodman radically underplays the positive or affirmative aspects of these sound cultures, focusing more on the materialist basis of what they do than the specific ways in which they shape and participate in sound. Notably, there is little sense of a desire for healing, transcendence, or even eroticism in his work. Why is this? As far as I see it, arguments that sound cultures are materialist tend to imply an exclusive focus on sound as an exterior force that can be mobilized in different ways. But is sound fundamentally exterior? One of the striking things about the Yonkers video is the intimate quality it has, like stream of consciousness or the representation of an inner psychic space. What if music's power was related to a fundamentally vibrational, if you like sonic, quality of consciousness? If you stop for a second and meditate, in other words, watch your mind, likely the metaphor you would use to describe the flux of consciousness that you find will be that of sound, of listening. Do you get that? Like, if you try to observe your mind, you can't watch your mind, really. But often the metaphor would be that you're listening to your mind, that you hear that you're a stream of consciousness, right? But again, mostly we try to block this out, this sonic quality of consciousness. And this is where Kristeva's work on abjection is so helpful. Odd Future's lyrics and videos repeatedly stage recognizable scenes of abjection. The staged suicides at the end of Tyler's Yonkers video, or the internet's cocaine, the vomiting imagery which I've noted in various music videos, the spectacular horrorcore violence of Odd Future lyrics. Abjection in Kristeva's work relates to an attempt to violently expel something from the self that is actually a constitutive part of the self. Thus, performative acts of violence can involve abjection. In Tyler's Yonkers, the splitting of the MC into a walking fucking paradox, part therapized teenager, part psychotic white killer, stages a scene of abjection where one gesture negates the next. Odd Future's work is full of this gesture of reversal. I'm thinking of the mind-blowing video for Hodgie, Domogenesis and Tyler's Rella. Have people watched that? Oh. Again, I highly recommend it. Where every act of violence rebounds in unpredictable ways on its perpetrator, ending with the castration of one MC and Tyler transformed into a coke-snorting feminine centaur on a hilltop who gets slapped in the face for dissing someone's mother. Often it seems like adolescent bargaining. I balance something gross or offensive with an attack on myself, and that makes it okay. What is original and interesting about Odd Future is the way that the homophobia, misogyny and misanthropy in their lyrics are consistently undercut by the return of the possibility of healing, of reparation too. This return tends to be figured, no doubt, as a threat or a danger in the face of which particular versions of masculinity must be performed in an aggressive way, but nevertheless, the trope of a desire for healing does emphatically and explicitly return. There's another level of abjection in Odd Future songs, though, and quite simply it consists of the way that the generally melodious and rhythmic quality of the music is juxtaposed with the violence of the lyrics, whether exteriorized posturing of some of the male rappers or the internalized violence of Sid the Kid's She Don't Give a Fuck. This structure is hardly limited to Odd Future songs. Reading Kristeva helps us understand the otherwise puzzling relation of sound, music, and violence. Abjection at this level would mean the violent organization or marking of sound in order to separate oneself from its more intimate and healing properties, from levels of the self that desire healing, that register and remember trauma, that repeat it as symptom, and through that symptom also express the desire for its transformation. Of course, given that what a song is a certain suturing of words or vocals to music, the performed separation from vibration necessarily requires its presence in order to be disavowed. What we call music is a practice of sonic access to that which precedes the historical and philosophical organizing of the subject-object relation. And this possibility of sonic access is recognizable in Odd Future. Of course, it's been there throughout the traditions of African American popular music, but perhaps never with quite such a psychoanalytic nuance and intensity. The video for Yonkers shows a single figure sitting and standing in a generic white space. It evokes the famous scene in The Matrix where Neo, the white indie nerd hacker, is inducted into the Matrix by the black, racially marked Morpheus. This in itself would be enough to mark the video as reworking the trope of Afrofuturism, now mutated into odd futurism, in a way that is symptomatic of the difficulties we have investing in ideas of the future today. It also invokes the work of Kara Walker and her silhouettes, which appropriate the iconography of the antebellum South. Tyler emerges from and back into a silhouette figure marked at the beginning by the caption Goblin, at the end by what is almost a stereotypical lynching image. The first silhouette arguably evades or seeks to evade capture as a racially legible image, a walking fucking paradox that is resolved by the tragically racially overdetermined lynching image at the end of the video. Tyler is alone throughout the video, except for a cockroach, which he tries to eat, but he can't keep it down. Presumably, he's on his own after that. Except that in the lyrics of the song, he then becomes a double consciousness, splitting into therapized, self-analyzing Tyler and psychotic white boy Wolf Haley with his fantasies of Columbine replays. And then he hangs himself, which leaves no one, except for the camera, which starts pulsing in and out of focus to the beat, like a visualized vibration. Or perhaps the breath, evoking Tyler's asthma, that difficulty in breathing that makes one hyperconscious of the breath. In fact, throughout the video, the camera plays a surprisingly active role, shifting in and out of focus, and Tyler addresses the camera very directly as what? Some other, capital O, that watches, witnesses, judges, but very weakly. Maybe the absent father that Tyler talks about in a lot of his songs. In other songs like Goblin, this other also takes the form of a therapist who actively responds to Tyler's lyrics. The video acts as counterpoint to the song, but the music, as always, remains something of a mystery. the music does have to do with pleasure, even despite the heaviness of the lyrics, no matter what the words say. It's minimal, mechanical in a swinging Kraftwerk kind of way, built around an atonal video game type noise and slightly whimsical digital piano chords. Even at the end of the video with the dangling body, the camera's pulsation to the beat, but also the beat itself conveys a twitching vitalism. And that's something to me that's striking in the video, is there is life after death somehow, after Tyler hangs himself. So why so lonely? There is the loneliness of the internet, of virtual communities in which people may indeed gather because they have nothing in common, or because they think they have something in common, but are not actually living in common. The situation of music today is oddly linked to this. People listen on headphones at their computers while working, often while not inhabiting the same physical space, or at other times inhabiting it but not consciously, therefore not truly together. Alienated, immaterial labor, including the work of making music, is by definition lonely. In the rap industry, after all, songs are work even when they evoke play. Yonkers is a song that straddles a class divide, the rapper as young entrepreneur, but also as worker in the industry. A quote from Marx's The Holy Family, re Alienation. The propertied class and the class of the proletariat present the same human self-estrangement, but the former class, the propertied class, feels at ease and strengthened in this self-estrangement. It recognizes estrangement as its own power and has in it the semblance of a human existence. The class of the proletariat feels annihilated. This means that they cease to exist in estrangement. It sees in it its own powerlessness and the reality of an inhuman existence. It is, to use an expression of Hegel, in its abasement, the indignation at that abasement, an indignation to which it is necessarily driven by the contradiction between its human nature and its condition of life, which is the outright, resolute, and comprehensive negation of that nature. Within this antithesis, the private property owner is therefore the conservative side, the proletarian the destructive side. From the former arises the action of preserving the antithesis, from the latter the action of annihilating it. So note that that's alienation expressed explicitly as abjection, as a structure of abjection. Thus, abjection plays itself out in the dual aspects of self-estrangement, in which free play folds back into immaterial labor. Our images and sounds no longer belong to us, and freedom itself has become a freemium product. Specifically in Yonkers, it is a black male body that exploits itself through an act of exhibitionism. Odd Future are themselves one of the first post-social media hip-hop success stories, accruing massive popularity through a series of mixtapes that have all been available as free downloads, while their only commercially available recordings, as Billboard magazine pointedly notes, have sold less than 15,000 units. The quote from Marx also reminds me of the mesmerizing new Frank Ocean record, Channel Orange, with its puzzlingly inscrutable evocation of life in Ladera Heights, the Black Beverly Hills, of sweet life with amazing shower pressure, of super rich kids, etc. And I don't know if people who've listened to the record, whether you're as baffled as I am as to why Frank Ocean is actually singing about these super rich kids. It seems like a non-obvious gesture, but one which he's obviously committed to. The description of the boredom and misery of the 1% in these songs ends up being as powerful an indictment of 21st century American capitalism as any description of mean streets, drug deals, etc. But it is an intensely alienating sound, since the lyrical content is radically moved from the lush, intensely effective R&B sound of Ocean's voice. In fact, one could say that the whole pathos of the new R&B sound of The Weeknd, Drake, Aloe Black, but especially Frank Ocean, rests in a very specific configuration of abjection and aloneness. When we're in our car, when we're on our own, for example in a car, we often listen to music. It breaks up the feeling of being alone. But why? Doesn't the blues work by turning alienation, abandonment, political and personal, into a basis for community and joy? You could build a whole economy around that. We have. One of the problems I have with Odd Future is that the way that logic plays out is a little too smooth, untroubled. This is what others have criticized in Tyler as emo whining. Tyler's work is definitely located at the place where raw self-exposure as marketing meets the anonymous attacks on vulnerability of the internet troll, with an actual adolescent male body mind somewhere in the mix. See at Fuck Tyler. Fuck Tyler is the name of Tyler the Creator's Twitter account. And no, Fuck Tyler is a beautiful statement of abjection. You negate Tyler in the very act of Tyler saying what's on his mind. Okay? Tyler himself says of this self-exposure, "These are the things I think about when I'm alone, that I don't like thinking about. It's not hard to think about, it's not hard to make, presumably this music, but I hate thinking about it, so I hate listening to it." So this strange notion that the very thought that comes into his mind, which constitutes his art, is also the thing that he hates and refuses to listen to. So that structure of abjection built into the very movement of creativity there. That's a pretty great description of sonic abjection. What does it mean to be alone with a sound? We could approach the topic again via abjection and the way, according to Kristeva, abjection restages primal separation from the mother's body through a gesture of separation, ejection, self-negation, becoming alone. But I'm interested here in thinking sonic aloneness through in relation to Roberto Esposito's notion of a depropriated community. Elsewhere, I have argued that sonic subcultures are able to produce something like communitas through a shared collective exposure to something without essence, to a sound which belongs to no one, to sound which belongs to no one, and which resonates with a certain unbelonging and impropriety of the subject that is collective, a being that is being with. And this idea of Esposito's, the core of it is that communities traditionally are built around a shared identity. But what Esposito wants to think through is the possibility of a community that is built through a shared recognition of not having an identity, of a kind of open wound that is shared that can't really be fixed, and that somehow a new kind of politics would emerge from the recognition of that as the commonality, the basis of community. And it's like a very difficult idea to imagine in one way. In another way, I think movements like Occupy are already instantiating that. And my argument here is that musical subcultures also are doing that. But there is something deeply traumatic about this exposure, the exposure of the open wound of our lack of a true, fixed, solid identity. which is why the moment of a collective unbelonging is transformed so rapidly and so often into subculture. In other words, a particular coding that outside of the moment of exposure provides an escape into a new form of identification. The subject is suspended between belonging and unbelonging, between propriety, in other words, having something that one owns, and impropriety, being in a situation of not owning, between an appropriated identity and depropriation. There is something very lonely about that suspended state. The subject, isolated from others in the very moment of collective exposure to and others. Personally, this is something I've experienced at shows and clubs all my life. I've had my moments in mosh pits and on dance floors of ecstatic jouissance at the limits of subjectivity. That was cool. It remains untheorized for the most part. But I'm also struck by how often that didn't happen. The moments where I remained just a spectator, a consumer, a subject. The word just is probably the crucial word in that last sentence. It indicates the twitchings, perhaps, of some other kind of life, truly an odd future, the yearning for a collective. So, are there alternatives to what is arguably a moment of crisis and revolution in masculinity in the Odd Future videos? Let's look at the recent video for Azealia Banks' smash hit 212. Maybe this is the leap from the dense theorizing to the music is a little jarring, but that's how I like to DJ too, so.
Hey, I can be the answer. I'm ready to dance when the vamp up. Then when I hit that dip, get your camera. You can see even that bitch shit's the camper. In the DM, that young sister beacon. The bitch who wants to compete. And I can freak fit that pump with the peep. And you know what your bitch become when her weave in. I just wanna sip that punch with your peeps. And sit in that lunch if you're treating. Kick it with your bitch who come from Parisian. She know where to get mine from in the season. Now she wanna lick my plum in the evening. And flip that tongue to deepen. I guess that can't get any in. 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 I was in the 212, I'm the uptown A nigga, you know what's up or don't you? Word of who made ya? I'm a rude bitch nigga, what are you made up of? I'ma eat your food up boo, I could bust your 8, I'ma do one too, fuck it gun do. When you do make bucks, I'ma look right nigga, bet you do want to fuck. Fuck 'em like you do want to come, you gated get discovered, I'm a 2-1 deuce cock, a lickin' in the water by the blue bayou, caught the warm goose, and you do rag too son. Nigga, you're a Kool-Aid dude, plus your bitch might lick it, wonder who let you come to 1-2, what you do to crew son? Fuck are you into, huh? Niggas better ooh run, you could get shot, homie, if you do want to. Put your guns up, tell your crew don't front. I'm a hoodlum, nigga, you know you were 2-1s. Bitch, I'm about to blue up too, I'm the 1-2 day. I'm the new shit boo, young Rapunzel. Who are you, bitch, new lunch? I'ma ruin you, cunt. I'ma ruin you, cunt. Ayo, ayo, I heard you riding with the same tall talent. I'm your mason, saying you're grinding, but you ain't going nowhere. No, why you procrastinating, girl? You got a lot, but you just waste all yourself. They'll forget your name soon, and will nobody be the same but yourself, yeah. What you gonna do when I appear? When I premiere? Bitch, the end of your life in there. This shit been fine. What you gonna do when I appear? When I premiere? Bitch, the end of your life in there. This shit been mine. Bitch, I'm in the 212 with the 5th cock, niggas, the 212. Fuck your gun do. When your goon sprayed up, bet this bitch won't get him. Bet you won't do much. See, even if you do want to bust, you bitch, you get your cut and touch your crew up too. Pop, you playing with your butter like a boo, won't you cock the gun too? Where you do eat coom, hun? I'm fucking with your cutie cue. What's your dick like, homie? What are you into? What's the run, dude? Where do you wake up? Tell your bitch keep hating. I'm a new one too, huh? See, I remember you when you were the young new face, but you do like to slumber, don't you? Now you boo up too, hun. I'ma ruin you, cunt. What you want to when I appear? When I prepare, bitch, the end of your life are there. The ship in mine. What you gonna do when I appear? When I prepare, bitch, the end of your life are there. The ship in mine. The ship in mine. The ship in mine.
So I spent a bunch of time on rapgenius.com studying the lyrics to both of these songs. And rapgenius.com is pretty good in principle because not only do you get the lyrics, you get this exegesis of the lyrics. But the exegesis of these songs is incredibly disappointing generally and just tautological. So if you go on rapgenius.com and read what is said about this song, it's stunningly mediocre. So it didn't help me at all. So I had to think about it some more. It strikes me, first of all, that the tropes of vomiting, of abjection and aloneness are notably lacking in this video. And at first, one might argue that there is no abjection here, or at least that the video and the performance comes from a different subject position in relation to abjection. And it would then be tempting to say that the appearance of the word cunt in the video marks this movement through into that which is abjected via the explicit and tabooed reference to the mother's body, the feminine body. The focus on the mouth, on orality, on, I guess, that cunt getting eaten, mark the post-house sonic production of Jacques Green and a body that is ecstatic in a joyful, relational kind of way. In other words, the movement into, through the vibrational cora, that space of abjection, doesn't result in an abdication of all sociality or sentience, as is normally assumed. You know, that basically people would go crazy if they moved into that which is abjected. And it would then be tempting to argue that one could oppose here a specifically feminine politics of vibration to the masculine traumas and dilemmas of Tyler the Creator. But then, in the Azealia Banks video, violence returns too, and as with Tyler, the violence is associated with tropes of homosexuality. The omnivorous feminine sexuality of the first stanza, in which the narrator brags about being able to seduce the respondent's girlfriend, turns into a more traditional put-down where the respondent's weakness, inability to fight, is expressed in terms of his having sex with men, masturbating, etc. The triumphant feminine cunt of the first stanza turns into the derogatory, abjected, masculine cunt of the second and third stanzas. It is as though the possibility of a relation of vibration is entertained in the first stanza, and then as usual abjected through performative, racialized and gendered violence in the second and third stanzas. We get to enjoy the pleasure of opening to vibration and the pleasure of rejecting, abjecting it, thus allowing the reintegration of identity. And I think that's a pretty good sum of the way most music works, is that there's a certain amount of opening, and then that opening is pulled back in a particular way that makes it safe again. But this dynamic is complicated in the video by the nerdy but implacable metrosexual white boy Jacques Green, who is in fact also the producer of the track. And, you know, just in terms of what I'm saying about a song being the suturing of music and words, the fact that the rap is actually addressed to the person who produced the music is a really interesting kind of twist on that. The sexual taunts are displaced onto race, and the structure of abjection is reversed. It is now a white male body that is being abjected by a black woman. Whom exactly this scene is staged for is an important question, and maybe we could talk about that. In his recent book, Extravagant Abjection, Blackness, Power and Sexuality in the African American Literary Imagination, Darius Scott points to the dynamics of abjection within African American history, and specifically in recent African American literature. Scott pays little attention to hip-hop or the relation of abjection to issues of vibrational ontology or sound, yet he points to the same ambivalent status of abjection within the histories and situations he analyzes. He formulates his interest as follows, quote, for the inheritor of blackness, who confronts it as a historical artifact, marking the defeat of his ancestors and defining the obstacles to his present possibilities, can blackness as abjection be understood or experienced as an aspect of historical experience, as a resource for the political present that broadens and even enriches the expanse of what is human being, rather than setting its limit or marking its terror-bound underside? And he gives a very interesting analysis of Toni Morrison's Beloved and the way that the trauma of slavery in Beloved is figured by the way that the enslaved men are forced to have sex with each other in that novel, and that this is the worst mark of slavery, is the fact that men are forced to have sex with each other. Odd Future and Azealia Banks, in this sense, appears to vacillate between a recognition that I am abject when I open to my immersion in as vibration, and the traumatic, repetitive pleasures of violating others, i.e., there is an abject and it's not me, it's you, which block the other recognition. Consider the third verse of Yonkers, which was mysteriously cut from the video. And this is kind of a strange thing, that this important lyric that actually goes with the style of the video isn't actually included in the video. It's cut from it. And maybe one of you has an explanation as to why that would be. I guess I'll read this. Why not? Still suicidal I am. I'm Wolf. Tyler put this fucking knife in my hand. I'm Wolf. Ace Gon put that fucking knife hole in my head. And I'm Wolf. That was me who shoved the cock in your bitch. What the fuck, man? Fuck the fame and all the hype, G. I just want to know if my father would ever like me. But I don't give a fuck, so he's probably just like me, a motherfucking goblin. Fuck everything, man. That's what my conscience said. Then it bunny hopped off my shoulder. Now my conscience dead. Now the only guidance that I had is splattered on cement. Actions speak louder than words. Let me try this shit. Dead. It's a fucked up lyric. That's also why, in the history of the complex dialectical development of hip-hop lyricism, it's important. Historically, male hip-hop artists have not spoken of subjectivity in this way, despite the many ways they've facilitated an enormous expansion in the possibility for realist and hyperbolic documentation of the situations of African Americans and others around the world. Commercial hip-hop has not explored and even embraced its own abjectness to this degree, for the reasons that Scott lists in Extravagant Abjection, namely, the ways in which the trauma of slavery and the Middle Passage has been articulated through sexualized, racialized, and gendered discourses that figure this trauma, the moment of abjection, as the collapse of a particular model of masculinity. This abjection is figured as homoerotic, passive, weak, in its narrativization of slavery as a sexualized submission to a white master. This trauma, it is of course traumatic, but Scott argues, and I agree, that its figuration as a specifically sexual violation, that's what the core of slavery is problematic. is then both repeated and nominally disavowed in a certain homophobic production of black masculinity as one that survives, indeed exists, insofar as it separates itself from the abjection of male-male love and desire. This would be true of the endless use of the word faggot in Odd Future songs. In Goblin, Tyler's therapist reminds him that he shouldn't use the word faggot, to which Tyler responds that he's not homophobic before calling the therapist a faggot. But again, there's a reversal, several in fact. There's the appearance last summer of Odd Future affiliate Lil B's recording I'm Gay, of Sid the Kid, the group's out lesbian DJ, and also the queer positive video for her song Cocaine, and more recently Odd Future member Frank Ocean's disclosure of a same-sex love, all important moments in hip-hop's history and future precisely because they reverse that abjection of queerness. And to me, it's very striking that Odd Future, on the one hand, are criticized, and rightly criticized, for their homophobic lyrics, and yet it's actually Odd Future that, in some sense, has brought queer identity into mainstream hip-hop. You know, and that's a very radical shift, and the conditions under which it's happened, maybe the turbulence that you see in Odd Future is kind of a necessary condition for that to happen. Maybe. A motherfucking goblin. Would hip-hop even exist without the term motherfucker and its variants? Earl Sweatshirt defines MCing as fucking these beats, i.e. erotically engaging with the sound. On the recent cypher track Oldie, at least 2 Odd Future rappers boast that their pads are the maxi, presumably because they absorb the maximum amount of flow, lyrical or menstrual. Again, I find Kristeva very useful in understanding why male musical or lyrical virtuosity should be so often figured as motherfucking. As I've indicated above, it may be that sonic immersion and oneness with the mother's body are somehow figures of undecidable precedence for each other, and that the Oedipal taboo on the mother's body is somehow present in many of our relationships to sound too. Scott's work raises further questions. If indeed there is a relationship between the figure of abjection and sonic or vibrational ontology, to what degree is the historical relationship between the Afro-diaspora, including the histories that lead to hip-hop and to Odd Future, and sound, overdetermined by the trauma of slavery for all who are its descendants, which, as Scott argues, means everyone alive today in the US? In other words, is the pleasure associated with popular Afro-diasporic sound forms not in fact ontological in a trans-historical sense, but the result of a particular set of histories in which sound becomes a privileged cultural form precisely because of the way in which it negotiates particular interrelated histories of abjection? Histories in which the possibility of other kinds of articulation of abjection are politically blocked or suppressed, so that only a repeated return to the maternal economy of sound, simultaneously commodified and performed for purposes of industry and commerce, is possible. I struggle with this, but so does Odd Future, and so does Azealia Banks. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make here. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could say more about the question of aloneness. I think I get where you're coming from in terms of thinking about some of the ways that we listen to music in terms of like, whatever, headphones and stuff like that. But also, it seems to me that even Tyler, the Creator, on his own, and certainly Azealia Banks and obviously Odd Future, there's such a kind of foregrounding of a kind of collectivity, or of a kind of, like Tyler himself is a kind of collective of all these different figures, right? And so for me, the figure is not so much like the double consciousness, but that of like the group or ensemble. And with Azealia Banks too, it's like her voice alters so much during the course of that song. She performs in such different ways, and then also the kind of her respondents, right, are so varied throughout the song. And I was having trouble kind of reconciling that kind of all of that kind of polyvocality and sort of collectivity with this question of aloneness, I guess.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that the Tyler video and the Azealia Banks video are different. Like they end up having a similar kind of weird reversal where they seem to open up in one way and then seem to return to a kind of performative violence in another way. But it's clear that the Azealia Banks video is a more social video. It's like there are other people in it, for one thing. She directly engages with them, whereas the Tyler video, that's not the case. And I guess the way I see it is that the splitting into these multiple consciousnesses, these characters, I mean, that's all happening on the interior of a particular subject. Like, they're not truly different people. Like, at best they're multiple personalities, and they're also kind of pathologized as such. And in fact, the skit, the way that Tyler uses them, only works because they're kind of breaks within an individual consciousness. But something else that strikes me in the Tyler video that I just noticed really watching it again this time is the lag between the lyrics, between the sound of the voice and then the lip syncing. That there's a kind of gap between the performance and then between the vocal performance and the visual performance that's really interesting. And
I don't think that's part of it. I think that's a mistake. I've seen the video before and it was synced.
yeah, I think there's a slight sync problem, but there's definitely parts in the video where he has his mouth shut and words are coming out. And it's a technique that's used in other Odd Future tracks where there's this kind of joke, basically, that the rap is continuing, but the lip syncing suddenly falls away. And I think that's a really interesting tension too. And what does it mean to be alone with your own mind? I guess that's the question that I have. And when that's figured sonically, is the sound of your own mind when you listen to it actually the sound of yourself? Like, do you relate to it entirely as yours, or does it become something else? And if, in Tyler's case, when you listen to the sound of your own thought and you hate it, but you repeat it, you have a very complicated economy that is emerging there from a single subjectivity's attempt to become aware of itself and articulate itself. So I think that there's a lot at stake in Tyler finding his way through his aloneness somehow. I mean, it also is specifically described in terms of his parents, and a lot of the Odd Future lyrics are to do with absent parents, actually. So there's that kind of aloneness.
Hi, I was wondering what you thought about the mediocre. I don't know, you said that the lyric website, their description was mediocre of the lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say that the general audience of the videos that we saw today, that they're mediocre, but I was wondering what you think of the general public is thinking. of these videos, like, are they taking it for granted, or if they're thinking about it critically and how that affects how they relate to the culture, and also what you think the intentions are of the director and the people who come up with these storyboards for the videos, if they're thinking about, you know, the imagery as critically as you are, or if they're just making entertainment in their minds and then thinking about the symbolism afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I
makes
think in the case of the Tyler video, I think he directed it, so there's that. With Azealia Banks, she probably didn't direct it, and to me the video is striking in that it seems to reinterpret or respond to the lyrics in a way that quite radically transforms them. But I think that's true of Tyler's Odd Future videos in general, that often the lyrics in Odd Future songs are very aggressively misogynist and homophobic, but the video that then provides the imagery that goes along with the song subverts and responds to that misogyny and homophobia in quite unpredictable and interesting ways. So I mean, for me, having listened to 212 and danced to it for probably 6 months and surrounded by people who love this song, and especially in my experience, a lot of women seem to be really attracted to this song and to find it a very empowering song. And so I was surprised when I actually read the lyrics, and you see the way that a good chunk of them are actually built on kind of homophobic insults as a way of providing the image of feminine power. And I kind of wonder whether people who dance to it, if they actually heard the lyrics, would feel so strongly about the song if they read the lyrics. But then I think the lyrics themselves are extremely complicated, and you can't simply call them homophobic. There's I mean, Azealia Banks has said she's bisexual. There's a kind of general play with sexuality that's going on in the song. It's just that homophobia is definitely a part of it, and that seems to disappointing in a certain way. Yeah.
Oh. Super. Going off that, I'm interested in the role of Azealia Banks's ecstatic nature and the representation of feminine pleasure in terms of potentially contesting what you label as homophobic lyrics, and what role that has in reversing hip-hop's abjection of queerness.
Yeah.
If you think that is
I think it's complicated. The way I see it, I guess, is that the song celebrates feminine pleasure, and it also specifically celebrates it as a kind of omnisexual feminine pleasure, that in the first it's both a kind of flirting, taunting with a man, but also a seduction of a woman, etc., etc. It's just that it's interesting that the image of feminine pleasure and ecstasy at some level is built on an abjection of the masculine, that is also built into it. And I think the video is very clever in the way that it deals with that, in that there's no particular mention of the race of the respondent, I don't think, in the lyrics of the song, but then you have this nerdy white guy who's kind of metrosexual, who's just standing there, and who, in one way seems totally awkward, but in another way seems unfazed by this kind of, taunting as well. And so I think in the video it's kind of balanced. Also the fact that he's white and that she's a black woman who's taunting him, like there is a reversal of a structure of abjection, that traditionally it's black people that have been abjected, like very specifically. And that's what Darius Scott's book is about. But Scott is also interested in reclaiming the possibility of a black subjectivity that is able to enjoy and include experiences of abjection, and he's particularly interested in the figure of the black bottom, from a queer point of view, as being a subjectivity that could be celebrated rather than being the purest symbol for the evil of slavery that can be narrativized, which he points to a number of examples in kind of classic African American literature where this is the case. So I think it's tricky, and I think the ecstasy is real, but it's paid for in a slightly strange way, which to me is an incomplete form of liberation. That's what I would say about it, finally. Yeah.
Hi. Hi.
Oh, hi.
I had a question, I guess, about really kind of literally the vibration of these songs. And I was wondering at all if you thought about the kind of beat structure to these different songs and the way that eroticism is kind of necessarily included in that vibration and in that beat structure, and how what you thought about that.
Yeah, it's hard to think about. If you teach a video like this in a class or you try to discuss it, nobody wants to say anything about the music, even though actually the music, especially in 212 with this kind of really propulsive beat that it has, it's really the beat that is the first thing that you experience and engage with. And that, to me, you're right. It's erotic, it's repetitive, you're immersed in it, you respond to it at a kind of pre-subjective level, and hip-hop and various other Afro-diasporic musical traditions are very good at mobilizing the power of rhythm and of vibration. What's interesting to me is then what is the relationship between the lyrics and the rhythm, between the violence of the lyrics, let's say, and the rhythm, which does seem to open up into a kind of ecstatic pleasure, as does the singing too, in a certain way, at least in the Azealia Banks. And is it impossible to just fully open up to the rhythmic vibratory quality of things? Is there a limit? Like if we switch genres and we talked about house music or techno even, like would we have a different story to tell? And let's not forget the importance of drugs in all of this as well, that drugs also act as amplifiers of that kind of rhythmic ecstasy in different ways with these different genres too. But I mean, that's a question that I would just open to all of you. Like, if you switch genres, like, is there more openness to ecstasy, or does the limit appear from somewhere else? Because it's fairly obvious that, for the most part, we don't dissolve into permanent ecstasy by listening to music. Something seems to limit that, and I'm curious whether the limit is interior to it, or whether it's just, an interruption that somehow comes from the symbolic order, from the law, to break to break what would otherwise be a full vibrational ontology.
Hi.
Hi.
How would one reconciliate two seemingly contradictory descriptions that you have just laid out? On the one hand, you projected a sort of identity affirmation in this musical project, and on the other hand, in the beginning you described the music as desiring an alternative, communitarian, unalienated existence,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously would have no identities as in the first case.
Oh wait, so the contradiction between the desire for community and
Affirmation of racial identity.
well, I mean, what's striking to me in Odd Future is that there's a refusal of identity there. Like, there's a very explicit refusal of identity. I mean, both the splitting into multiple identities, but I mean, I guess there's the gang, there's Odd Future, and there's this song on their latest record called Oldie, which is very strikingly different to a lot of the other videos because it's a cipher track. They all kind of freestyle, but the video is like of all of them hanging out together and pretending to lip sync to the tracks. But I mean, that to me is where this notion of a depropriated community is interesting. That it's a community built around the recognition of a wound rather than a community built around stamping everyone with a particular subcultural identity. And I think there is something like that going on in Odd Future. It's very interesting, the way they present themselves as a gang, because it's so fractured, so broken, so messed up, all the individual narratives. Does that answer? Do you want to push back a little bit and maybe it'll help me?
Well, I'm not sure if answer to that question would be available to us today, and it's just that
You're fading in and out.
oh, I'm not sure if one would be able to answer that. So, but I can see that the way you described identities, community as how would one put it? Subjectivity, not non-subjectivity. What was that? The community of difference, right?
Yeah.
Which would have no subjects of shared identity.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, the music was marked as black racial.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a complicated issue with Odd Future. One of the things that's said is that a lot of their audience is actually a white audience, and so the identification of it as being part of, African American tradition is complicated. I mean, it definitely is that on the one hand, but on the other hand, the explicit evocation of skateboard culture, of punk, of different subcultural scenes, all of which have their own discourses of abjection attached to them, is an interesting twist on that too. And I don't know, if one wanted to think of Odd Future as potentially part of a post-racial culture, I think that there is a hint of that there. but it's just a hint, and it's very hard to. I mean, you can't just make that happen. Or maybe I would say there's a desire. There's a desire there.
Hi.
Hi.
I think I've been thinking about the issue of vibration somewhat differently recently through doom and drone metal, which is what I write about. And you're asking what difference vibration might make in different musical genres. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and I was hoping maybe you could talk more about, is this idea of interiority and exteriority in relation to collectivity. Just in response to the first question, you said how you made a distinction between multiple personalities in Tyler the Creator, which is maybe a multiplicity that was internal, and then the idea of collectivity, which is a multiplicity that's external.
Yeah.
Though I was very interested in something I read about is how sound might complicate these ideas of internality and externality, and certainly abjection does, because that's an interiority created through what is externalized.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I was wondering, I mean, maybe my question is just very simple. What's the difference, do you think, between multiple personalities and a collectivity? I mean, what difference does that make? And I mean, especially thinking about, how that relates to a politics.
It's an interesting point, because you I mean, you could well say that once you open up to this community that is not built around holding on to an identity, that one of the possibilities there is a multiplicity of subject formations that pass through the subject. And that seems possible. What I would say, though, is that the particular form of a multiple personality that constitutes repeated processes of reversal and inversion is a little different from that. That in a way, it turns that potential opening to the multiple back into a repetitive form, because it keeps doubling back on itself. And, there's this gross gesture that at the same time is perhaps quite beautiful in terms of the I don't know what, obscenity it opens up. And yet that then is immediately kind of pounced on by this other figure who then turns that beauty into a kind of violence. And, that's reassuring. And that's maybe again, a form of incomplete opening. I think the issue of drone metal and doom metal is, I just wrote a primer on drone music, so I've been spending a lot of time listening to droney metal and stuff. But yeah, absolutely. What's interesting with drone is, and why people hate it a lot of the time, is that this repeated sound irritates your sense of a subject in time. It starts to dissolve that, and if you resist it, it's irritating. And if you open to it, then you necessarily have to let go of yourself to a certain degree, and a more or less psychedelic experience tends to ensue. And one of the characteristics of really listening to drone music is that what seems to be just one single repeated boring sound actually opens up into a kind of soundscape where there's actually a lot going on. I mean, Lamont Young says tuning is a function of time, so that the longer you focus on something, the more you tune into vast amounts of stuff that are going on in the sound. Or is it in the you that's listening to the sound? And that's that confusion of interior and exterior that, is why music is so powerful, is because, it has very easy access to us for some reason. But I think the question of why that is, why are we moved by music, is still, there aren't really very good answers to that. It's amazing how little that has been thought through in a way.
I wanted to ask a second question about the sexual politics of all these videos. I really appreciated at the end you were talking about the kind of the kind of queer politics of potentially of Odd Future videos, and I was thinking about how it's interesting how different the kind of sexual politics of Sid's videos are, right? Because so you were mentioning her as a kind of example of the kind of potential queer positivity of Odd Future, and so in her videos they're very narrative, romantic, kind of she's with the, I've only seen 2 of them, right? But she's with the girl and there's a story for why they're together, and then they kiss and hold hands and stuff. Whereas the kind of queer femininity of the videos that are mostly boys, like Rella and other Odd Future collective videos, are it's just monstrous kind of queer femininity that's they're like you were saying, sort of like a centaur wearing a wig, snorting coke, Darth Vader, strippers, whatever, right? And so I was thinking though that in some ways the kind of monstrous queer femininity of those boy videos, I guess I'll call them, is ultimately always kind of recuperated, as in the video we just watched, into this kind of I think ultimately kind of corny crisis in masculinity. Whereas as for Azealia Banks, I think she's mobilizing the same kind of monstrous queer femininity, you know what I mean, this kind of omnivorous sexuality that you were talking about, and she's mobilizing it in relation to a tradition. So she's addressing Nicki Minaj, who also has this kind of monstrous, voracious, queer kind of feminine sexuality, right? In her, and that's mixing love and war, I guess, in some way, right? So it's about a relation among women that's about love and war. And I was wondering, I guess, if you could, talk about do you, about the kind of queer femininity of all of these, in these videos, if you see a kind of thread running through there, and also maybe just to suggest that maybe that's why women like Azealia Banks. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the notion that you use the word monstrous, and I think the word grotesque, would describe a lot of the Odd Future videos really well. And, the grotesque has that double function of both this kind of opening up to cosmic flows of life and death, but also of recuperating particular forms of masculinity and femininity as well, through monstrosity. And I don't know, the gonzo quality of a lot of the Odd Future videos, it's interesting, but to me the point there is just that it would be included in the repertoire of the masculine, and that within mainstream hip-hop, the repertoire of what constitutes acceptable masculinity is a very limited space, and that the opening up of that space is a kind of important, but I think very anxiety and filled and fraught endeavor. Azealia Banks, yeah, absolutely. She's gleefully performing a kind of monstrous feminine. It's not so monstrous, really, but again, from the point of view of appropriate gender roles, etc., it is breaking a bunch of rules. Again, the disappointment there is that in order to create a kind of larger, more powerful image of the feminine and of a queer feminine, that somehow it still relies on the negation of a certain version of the masculine that seems all too bound to traditions that we know a lot about. And so I guess that's what I would say.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, everyone.